And that's for the people that have RSVP'd and weren't able to make it. We're going to send all of these resources, the slides, the video, every resource that we've mentioned throughout is going to be sent to you at the end of this week. You can also find that recording on our YouTube channel. Just type in Tacoma-Pierce County Affordable Housing Consortium. That mouthful is a lot, so I'm going to just put those words in the chat here. All right. So welcome. If you have joined us before, welcome back. And if you're new, joining us for the first time, welcome. We're going to continue our Lunch and Learn series this week by taking a little bit of a step back. We're going to learn about the history of racially restrictive covenants and segregation within Pierce County. Today, we're going to be diving into what racially restrictive covenants are, how they encourage segregation, and what those harmful planning tools have done to shape Pierce County, planning, housing, those terms. And we're also going to learn what current legislation is seeking to rectify those harms. And the researchers behind a lot of this work are here to present with us. Leading the presentation today will be researchers working on the Racially Restrictive Covenants Project from the University of Washington, Project Director Dr. James Gregory, and Research Associate Sophie Bells. So right before we get introductions to our presenters, let me just briefly introduce myself and our organization. So my name is Casey Twiggs. I'm the membership coordinator for the Affordable Housing Consortium. I will be your host. The consortium is a nonprofit membership-based organization that provides advocacy and education to support the expansion of affordable housing in Pierce County. So we do this by educating the public, by holding special meetings, lunch and learns like this, collecting data to share with the public on housing needs and local policy. And we also advocate on the state, or at the local level rather, on policies and funding to support more creation of affordable housing and bolster the work of our members. So altogether, our agency has about 60 members, ranging from affordable housing advocates, developers, financiers, construction companies, architects, and individuals, all advocates for affordable housing. And now let me introduce our guest for this lunch hour. Sophie Bells is a junior at the University of Washington, studying history with a concentration in race, gender, and power, as well as an intended minor in labor studies. Her academic interests include contemporary American history, labor history, and legacies of imperialism and colonialism. As a research associate, she's involved in research, data management, and community outreach. And Dr. James Gregory is a professor of history and director of the UW Racial Restrictive Covenants Project. Sorry about that. Which is part of the Civil Rights and Labor History Consortium at the University of Washington. Very, very cool. His prize-winning books and many articles focus on American labor, civil rights, and migration history, as well as the Pacific Northwest. He has been researching the history of segregation in Seattle and Washington states since 2005. We are really, really excited to have you both here, very, very interested in this topic, what it means for housing, and excited for the information we're about to receive. Really, really quickly before we dive in, just some minor housekeeping. If you have any questions or comments, just feel free to, you can type them in the chat or just hold them till the end. We're going to have time at the very end for discussion and questions. We'll have plenty of time for that. So you'll hold your questions till the end, or just throw them in the chat and we'll get to them. If you do ask a question at the end verbally, if you wouldn't mind just taking yourself off mute, turning your camera on so we can see you if you don't mind, and we'll have a good discussion. With that, I'm going to pass it over to Sophie and Dr. Gregory.
Well, thank you, Casey. I'm Jim Gregory, as you mentioned, professor of history and director of the project. I wasn't supposed to be here. Sophia Dowling, who is the project coordinator, usually works with Sophie and other associates in giving these presentations. But Sophia came down with the flu, so I'm a fill-in. And so that's one of the things I want to kind of warn everybody about. This is going to be a little less put together than our normal presentations. And the other caveat is we have we have a lot of information about King County. And we give a lot of presentations to King County agencies and community groups and schools and things like that. But this is our first Pierce County, Tacoma presentation. And as you'll see, we're sort of struggling to have as much detail, which is where I want to ask for help. At the end of this, if we have Q&A time, it would be really helpful if you all could tell us more than we currently know about how things have been working in Tacoma and Pierce County. So with that, I'm going to fire up our PowerPoint and turn things over to Sophie, who incidentally is a graduating senior. Honors, just completed her honors thesis. So, Sophie, it's all yours.
Okay, great. Thank you, Professor Gregory. Um, okay, as I said, we're the Racial Restrictive Covenants Project. This project initially began under Professor Gregory in 2005, and it expanded in 2021 when it was tasked with identifying and mapping racially restrictive covenants in every county across the state. So I'll go to the next few slides to go over this. Today, we're going to be going over what racial restrictive covenants are and what our project does in terms of mapping them and the implications of that. We're going to show you guys some of our mapping and data, which you can also access online via the website if you want to have more interaction with that information or look at information more specific to Pierce County. We're going to talk about local segregation history in both King County and Pierce County, the eventual end of racial restrictive covenants, and then what the legacy of these covenants is today and why these really matter in the makeup of Pierce and King County. I'm gonna go to the next slide. Like I said, this project expanded in 2021 and it's now divided into two teams. Our team is based at the University of Washington and identifies and maps restrictions west of the Cascades. The other team is based in Eastern Washington University and tackles all of the counties to the east. So this really is statewide, but we're just kind of focusing on a part of it. In the next slide, you'll be able to see the current and recent team members at UW. And we're all students or recent graduates at UW. Next slide. Not every county in Washington has digital records. A lot of our research takes place in the archives where we flip through hundreds of pages of old deeds, like you can see in these books, or slowly looking through microfilm, which takes a lot of time. Next slide. As you can imagine, flipping through books and deeds and rolls of microfilm takes a lot of time and is not as ideal as counties that have digital records, which we can look through more quickly. When we started this project, King County only had part of the records digitized. And with over 1 million records to look through by hand, we knew that that wasn't going to be a feasible task. So in autumn, we rented a high-speed scanner and our team spent months in the office digitizing this microfilm. Fortunately, it was easier to work with Pierce County records since they have all been digitized by the county auditor's office, which allowed us pretty easy access. One of our team members, Nicholas Boren, is a computer expert and developed a program to search millions of records for the racist terms and suspected restrictions, which has allowed us to get through this information a lot more quickly. We also utilize Zooniverse, which is an online platform that allows real people and community members to get involved in our research. So far, we've had over 1,000 community members get involved in this work, and we regularly host events where we orient people towards Zooniverse. We partner with service learners at Seattle Central College, students at local high schools, and other groups to help where people can look through these documents from the comfort of their homes and help us with this project. It's a really crucial part of the research, and we're very, very thankful to everyone who's taken their time to work on this, and we encourage anyone who's interested to help us out on Zooniverse as well. Now I'm going to show you some of the interactive maps that are available on the Covenant or the project website. This map shows 60,000 restricted properties that we have identified in the 8 counties of the Puget Sound. More than 2/3 of these, around 44,000, are in King County. Pierce County has 4,500 identified restrictions, Snohomish has 4,200, Kitsap has around 2,000, Thurston has 1,600, and there are more in other counties, though smaller amounts. You can find separate bundles of maps for each county that allow you to zoom in and look at more specific details on the project website. These maps will soon also allow you to zoom in by specific address. This is a screenshot of our maps from King and Pierce County. This interactive map can be explored online where you can zoom in on individual properties and read the specific language of the covenants used in them. Our previous mapping format highlighted restricted subdivisions and provided details about the developer who restricted the property and the restriction type. It is important to note that these maps show the specific time period restrictions were most prevalent. Areas that were newly subdivided between 1926 and 1952 were the most likely to restrict because it was easier for developers to restrict new rather than existing subdivisions that had already been developed. Keeping this in mind, we should also note that areas that appear to not have restrictions might also have been restricted by other means. So just because there isn't a covenant doesn't mean that certain religious or ethnic groups were welcome to live in that area. I'm now going to pass it off to Professor Gregory, who's going to talk a bit about the real estate industry.
So let's do a little of the history of this particular device for exclusion and segregation. Racial restrictive covenants became most popular in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. We found some earlier, including one in Pierce County we'll show you a little later. A lot of the this campaign to totally restrict property, not just in the current phase, but forcing future owners to abide by these racist restrictions. This became a project of the real estate industry, real estate professionals. The National Association of Real Estate Boards conducted campaigns across the country, and the local boards in Tacoma and Seattle were responsible for a lot of this, pushing developers to restrict their properties starting in the 1920s. Here you can see that the National Association of Real Estate Boards was implicated in all sorts of racist property strategies, and this part of their code of ethics specified that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or use which will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. And what that meant is that if an agent did show or sell or be part of selling a property to a person of color, they could lose their membership and thus access to the listings. So it was a very powerful tool for making sure that realtors abided by this. The real estate industry was the primary mover, but the federal government in the 1930s got into the process of supporting and promoting racial restrictions. In the 1930s, the Great Depression destroyed the housing industry. Millions and millions of people lost their homes to foreclosure, and banks stopped making loans of any kind. The New Deal administration of under Roosevelt, created 2 federal agencies to get the real estate industry to help recover. Homeowners Loan Corporation made emergency loans to existing homeowners, and the Federal Housing Administration set up a new system of supporting through insurance mortgage lending, essentially creating the modern housing market where you can expect to get a loan for amortized loan for 30 years or more. Before then, loans were repayable after 7 years, not amortized. So it was very difficult. This essentially over time created the widespread homeownership, the homeownership nation, if you will, that becomes clear by the 1950s and 1960s. Unfortunately, it was a white homeownership nation because these agencies explicitly promoted racial exclusion. The famous redlining maps, here you can see Tacoma's map, were produced in 1935 and 1936 in cities across the country. And they were to guide the banks and lending agencies, showing them where it would be safe to make a loan and where it would be more risky for them. Any area that had people of color, Black, Asian, or often of European immigrants, was marked red and thus risky. And this had the effect over time of suppressing the ability to get loans. This is what we mean by redlining. Redlining refers to the process of loan making and where banks and lenders would make loans and where they wouldn't. And it essentially made it nearly impossible for people of color in these red areas to get regular mortgages at regular rates. A little bit about the history of race in Washington State. I think many of you are very familiar with this, but didn't all start in the 20th century. Right from the start, after white conquest and settlement of Washington State and the suppression of Indian land rights and moving people off their land into little reservations, and the carving up and handing out more or less free of large land grants to settlers coming in, the continued suppression of indigenous opportunities was shown, I think, most visibly in the 1860s when the little town of Seattle completely banned indigenous Americans from residing for a while. In the 1880s, as the Chinese American population began to grow, there were driving out campaigns. Tacoma destroyed its Chinese community in 1885, followed by Seattle. All of this time, there were very few African Americans in Washington State. That population grew slowly in the early decades of the 20th century, and then more significantly during and after World War II. But here you can see some of the demographics of where people could live. I think I went by this too quickly. So as of 1960, African Americans, and this would also apply to Asian Americans, and for pretty largely true also of Jewish Americans, this narrow area of the central part of Seattle was virtually the only place where people could rent, buy, or reside. If you get close in this map, you see all those census tracts with 0% or 0.1% African American residency. And for Pierce County, it's more or less the same. I think the Hilltop area was virtually the only place where Black Americans could live. That dark area is McNeil Island. So there was a Black population on McNeil Island and an even larger one at Fort Lewis. But everywhere else, virtually no Black or Asian people allowed to live as of 1960. So this brings us to, an important point that people in Washington State often are confused by. They think that segregation and civil rights movements, for that matter, are something that only happened in the South, not in Seattle and Tacoma. And there were differences between the Jim Crow system of the South and the Jim Crow system of racial subordination and suppression in Washington State, but they're less profound than you imagine. The state of Washington did not mandate separation, as was true in Alabama and most southern states where it was mandated by state law. But the state of Washington contributed through these restrictive covenants and other ways to the promotion of racial segregation and subordination. So here is a notorious restaurant north of Seattle called Coon Chicken Inn, and you can see what the whole purpose of this restaurant was. It was to celebrate the subordination of African Americans. It was very popular all the way through up through the early 1950s. Segregation practices in Seattle and Tacoma and the rest of the state also extended beyond housing. Black and Asian Americans were routinely denied service in bars, restaurants, barbershops. We've also looked at the main Seattle hospitals. We haven't had a chance to do this for Tacoma. And in the 1940s, Black and Asian people could not be patients in the main hospitals, Swedish Hospital, Virginia Mason, Providence, the ones that are still very prominent, would not treat people of color. So we should be very cautious about thinking that things are a lot better in Washington State than they were in the South. Sophie, I think you're taking over here, right?
Yeah, now I'm going to highlight a few specific restrictions in Pierce and King County. One of these is developed by William Boeing, the founder of Boeing Aircraft, the world's largest aerospace company and manufacturer of commercial planes, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with. He was a prominent Seattle resident and a notorious restrictor of housing subdivisions. He and his wife, Bertha, purchased large tracts of land in what is now northwest Seattle and Shoreline, and all of his subdivisions were restricted to only people who were white or Caucasian. In 4 subdivisions alone, the Boeings restricted a total of 960 properties to white residents only. It was more complicated to impose restrictions on older neighborhoods. As a result of this, neighborhood associations sometimes organized petition campaigns to convince fellow residents to bind their properties with a racial covenant. One of the best documented efforts restricted most blocks in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle. Starting in 1927, the Capitol Hill Community Club organized a 3-year campaign during which 964 property owners signed petition covenants restricting 183 blocks and ultimately 958 lots of property from Black people. The groups targeted by restrictions and the language used in the restrictions varied. Many restrictions simply said white or Caucasian only, but others targeted specific groups using language that is often offensive and confusing today. For instance, many restrictions, like this one for Sunnydale Gardens in Tukwila, used Ethiopian to refer to a Black person regardless of their ethnic origin. The term Malay was used in some of these documents to refer to Filipinos. Many covenants made explicit exceptions for the case of live-in domestic servants, work that was dominated by Black women and Asian men. Shocking and racist language can also be seen in this 1946 restriction, which used Nazi terminology to restrict a small group of properties in Clyde Hill to the Aryan race only. This is especially disturbing considering the Nuremberg trials had been worldwide news in the years prior. This next restriction in Lakewood is one of the restrictions that we found in Pierce County. We found that many of these restrictions primarily kept people in certain areas, military personnel, and related to the military base and military action. This is one of the first covenants that we've seen. It's from 1908, and it restricts this group using very specific language. Some of these restrictions are also unique in their restriction of Hindus as an ethnic group, which we don't see quite as frequently. Okay. And in the next slide, even though the use of restrictive covenants was prevalent, they were not the most powerful tool of segregation, and the fact that we have found few or none in some neighborhoods really means little about the openness of these areas to different religious or ethnic groups. We go to the next slide. Social means, violence, harassment, and the actions of realtors were the large forces in keeping certain racial and religious groups of people out of certain areas. The social enforcement was often handled by real estate agents who blocked access and by white neighbors and community members who harassed and threatened non-white residents. If harassment failed, violence often followed. In 1941, this violent enforcement of segregation affected the life of Carl Brooks, a civil rights activist whose home in the restricted Lago Vista neighborhood of Shoreline was bombed in an act of racial violence. After Brooks' family faced repeated harassment in their predominantly white neighborhood, race terrorists threw a dynamite bomb into the family's home, endangering the lives of their sleeping children. This act of terror was not reported in major daily newspapers in Seattle, only by the local left-wing weekly newspaper. The fact that this explicit act of racially motivated terror was ignored by major media demonstrates the broad institutional acceptance and support for restriction. This article to the left of the screen states that the sheriff's office at the time condoned the campaign of intimidation that preceded the dynamite bombing. This is a prime example of Seattle sundown zone law enforcement. Until the late 1960s, Seattle and other police forces in King County and Pierce County enforced informal sundown rules and zones. In the evenings after work, African Americans were not supposed to be in white neighborhoods, and they would often be stopped, questioned, and harassed if they were seen. These sundown zones highlight the social enforcement that accompanied or acted as a substitute for the use of racial restrictive covenants to ensure the segregation of King County. I'm now going to pass it off to Dr. Gregory to talk more about these legal challenges.
So let's talk a little bit about the law and why this was allowed to happen and actually encouraged to happen. Initially, segregationists in various states tried to restrict African Americans and other people of color using zoning ordinances. Zoning became possible under state and federal law in the early decades of the 20th century. The Supreme Court in 1917 said that explicit zoning by race was unconstitutional, that states couldn't do that. So that actually set off the flurry of action towards restrictive covenants, which are not zoned. They're private instruments imposed on certain properties. And the Supreme Court initially said that's fine. In a critical ruling in 1926, the Supreme Court said, oh, this is different than zoning. Yeah, you can do it. And what they were saying there is that these are enforceable contracts that state courts around the United States would enforce. The NAACP, who had challenged all of this, they challenged the zoning racist restrictions and then the restrictive covenants in that 1926 case. They lost that, but they kept trying. And in 1948, in a St. Louis case, Shelley v. Kramer, the Supreme Court changed its mind and said, well, I guess to have courts enforcing these ordinances is a form of state action, which should not be allowable under the 14th Amendment. So after 1948, the courts were no longer supposed to be enforcing this. But here's the point. People, or journalists in particular, are confused about the Shelley v. Kramer case and think that that ended racial restrictive covenants, and it didn't. It had very little impact at all. And in fact, courts continued to enforce it all the way through the 50s in some states. But in general, getting the courts out of the picture was really meaningless because very few cases ever went to court. The existence of a racial restriction was enough to stop people from moving into an area, and neighbors, as Sophie pointed out, enforced restrictions through violence and other means. So the difference between 1948 and 1965 is virtually nil. In Washington State, in Pierce County and other counties, new restrictions were added in the 1950s. And I think in Snohomish County, we have one that was added as late as 1967. And all the way through this time period, they were completely legal. Completely legal. There was nothing improper about a homeowner restricting their property because it was completely legal to discriminate on the basis of race. That finally changed in 1968. But here you can see all along there was resistance to this kind of segregation and subordination activity by communities of color, especially African Americans, but also Filipino Americans were active in this, and Japanese Americans, and all sorts of allies, white allies. In 1964, Seattle got to vote on a fair housing measure. The city council was too shy to actually create the measure itself. So they said, oh, well, we'll send it to a vote. And I don't know whether Tacoma ever held votes on this. Many cities across the country by 1964 had passed ordinances, fair housing ordinances. But when it came to a vote in Seattle, as you can see here, it was turned down by the voters by a measure of 2-1. So much for Seattle liberalism as of the 1960s. But in the wake of Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, prohibiting discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. And Seattle City Council passed something similar, and the next year the state legislature passed. So since 1968, it's been supposedly illegal to discriminate, and that ended the era in which racial restrictive covenants were supposed to matter. But just to emphasize this time period, that we shouldn't be thinking 1948, we need to think 1968. The violence against people of color moving into certain areas continued. And those of us who teach at the University of Washington understand the significance of this particular incident in 1958. Marion and Ray West were a mixed race couple. He was not able to buy property near the University of Washington, but she was. So they bought a little rooming house for the purpose of providing housing for Black students who otherwise couldn't live anywhere near the University of Washington. And for a number of years, they maintained this against constant harassment from the nearby community. And finally, in 1958, they woke up to find a cross burning in their front yard next to their children's bedroom. And that pretty much did it for them. Here you can see a newspaper article about it. And shortly thereafter, they moved away from, the university district. So that was 1958. And we've got examples of bombings and shotgun shootings in 1964 in Kent and elsewhere. And I'd really like you folks to help us find incidents and learn about what was going on in Pierce County. We're particularly interested in showing what were effectively sundown towns and sundown zones where African Americans would be harassed, not only couldn't live there, but really wasn't comfortable to be on the streets after working hours. Sophie, is this still me? I think this is still me. Yeah. So here are some maps on our website. You can find these along with everything else we're showing, and they're interactive on the website, whereas here they're just screenshots. But here we're showing the changing demography of Tacoma and Pierce County from 1960. I already showed you this, where basically the only areas where African Americans could live were near Hilltop. So 20 years later, 1980, so now, there's been a law against discrimination for 12 years, but not much has really changed. So the real change, the desegregation of these cities, and this would be true for King County as well, is post-1980. And so what you see, the 1980 map, not much has changed, but by the most recent 2020, you can see a dispersion of African American households throughout, much of Pierce County, but there are still areas where you see like 1% or some really, really marginal percent. And here's the story for Asian American residential distributions. We didn't have a 1960 maps. The one on the left is 1970, but you can see pretty much overlap with Black households in that first period, and then more dispersion. So the Asian populations are different. Both Black populations in Seattle and Tacoma have increased dramatically over these since 1960, but Asian American populations have really exploded thanks to immigration law changes that have made it possible for people of all Asian countries to come in significant numbers. So you can see some change by 1980, but especially that immigration law was just beginning to take effect then. And the more recent map is showing not only more freedom to move to different areas, but much bigger populations. Sophie, this is your turn.
Yeah. So really these stories and statistics that we've talked about are not just history, as Professor Gregory was saying. The legacy of restrictive covenants and other modes of segregation continue to produce inequality generation after generation in King and Pierce County. Restrictions suppressed home ownership and wealth building opportunities for Americans of color who were locked out of most neighborhoods and had trouble obtaining loans because of redlining during the post-war decades, when the federal subsidies helped most white families become homeowners. Although formal restrictions have eased in the decades following the 1970s, the rising cost of homes is an enormous obstacle to home ownership for families of color, who are much less likely to own and afford homes than their white counterparts who have been accumulating real estate wealth for generations. Take a look at this graph on the right of the screen. This shows home ownership rates by race since 1970. The most recent census reports a disparity of 70% homeownership for white families compared to only 38% for Black families. In King County, this rate is even lower, with only 28% of Black families owning homes. The trend line for this data is alarming. You can see it gradually falling from 1970, when 50% of Black families owned homes. Since then, this rate has fallen decade after decade. Why is this? This next chart shows the median home price by race and decade. In 2022, the median home in Pierce County was valued at more than 30 times as much as in 1970, from just over $16,000 to $500,000. This price inflation far exceeds income inflation, which has only increased tenfold in the same period. This means that while it's possible for families selling or exchanging properties to continue patterns of generational homeownership, for a family trying to buy for the first time in this post-covenant restriction decades, and for those selling undervalued homes, it is necessary to have a much higher income in order to afford a home. The point is that in the last 3 decades, buyers have needed wealth to get started. Wealth in the form of inheritance or high-paying jobs. Highly paid business and professional class migrants from California, New York, and across the Pacific have been able to join this pricey housing market, while those with average incomes or without family property wealth have lost out. The most enormous disadvantage that Black families in Pierce County is made clearer when we consider income. At every income level, white families are more likely to own homes than Black families. This chart on the slide shows the home ownership rates in a 2018 census counts. The gap becomes enormous below $75,000. At the $50,000 income level, for example, white families are 3 times more likely to be homeowners than Black families. Remarkably, 47% of white families at this modest income level own homes. Here we see the effect of multi-generational wealth building. At current prices, new buyers with modest incomes are shut out of home ownership unless they have access to generational wealth, which is often achieved through property ownership. Now, Professor Gregory is going to talk more about the Covenant Home Ownership Act.
Yeah, so it's time for the good news. This project starting in 2000, it started way back, but in 2021, the legislature decided that it was time to learn about, the extent of these kinds of discriminations and discriminatory practices throughout the state. So they funded our project, and as Sophie mentioned, the Eastern Washington group is doing the eastern counties. And so that funding has made all this work possible. But last year, after we had demonstrated already, we had found about 50,000 restrictions. Now we're up to about 65,000 statewide. But last year, the legislature took a look at the data and decided to do something to make amends. So the House Bill 1474, the Covenant Homeownership Act, was passed in May, and it establishes two things. One, it declares that the state of Washington caused this harm. The state of Washington takes responsibility because it enabled, through the courts and the counties and the deferred authorities, it enabled this practice of generational homeownership suppression and discrimination. So both through restrictive covenants and then the ways that the state helped with redlining and other discriminatory practices. So the law establishes, first of all, responsibility, which is very critical, because then it purports, or then it plans to make amends, to compensate the victims in the same way that a tort action, those of you who know about law, you cause harm, you're responsible for compensating the victims. So the state of Washington is going to compensate the victims of this harm. And but specifically, the plan is to raise a lot of money through a fee on property transactions imposed on any time anybody's selling current property. They're going to pay they've already been doing this, $100 fee that goes into the homeownership account, covenant homeownership account. And that should raise something like $75 to $100 million a year to be used in this form of compensation. The specific compensation that is planned is down payment assistance in the form of a no-interest loan to persons who are first-time home buyers at or below the median income for the county, and they lived in Washington State and suffered discrimination prior to 1968, or their descendants. So the 1968 law changed everything, and after that, the state of Washington was no longer participating directly in this kind of suppression of homeownership and discrimination. So that's the threshold, and it means that most families of color somebody who, like my age, I was alive in 1968, but so they can be the child or grandchild of somebody who lost the ability to purchase a home because of racist restrictions, and now is seeking for the first time to purchase a home. And these loan amounts will be very substantial. The National Fair Housing Association has just completed a study called For By the Law that is recommending some guidelines. The state Housing Finance Commission, I'm sorry, I'm blanking things here. The State Housing Finance Commission is in charge of implementing the law, and they are going to, in the next couple of weeks, issue the actual guidelines that'll probably follow the recommendations of the National Fair Housing Association report. And so it's going to then probably recommend that the amount of down payment assistance is conditioned by the housing market of different counties or cities. So, people living in the East where housing prices are one thing will not be eligible for as much funding as people living in Puget Sound and King County and Pierce County with the highest property values. But it should enable hundreds of families who have been locked out of the housing market for generations. As Sophie pointed out, it's a generational wealth problem. If you didn't have access to that great era of home buying where anybody who was white and had a modest income could get a very low interest loan, very low down payment, big housing, construction. So it was very easy. But if you didn't get in on the game a generation ago, it's been very hard ever since. And so this law is meant to correct that. And here's just another, the primary sponsors of this law, which passed, I think there was, 1 or 2 Republican votes. It had a lot of bipartisan support up to the end, and then Republicans bailed out saying it's a good law, but we don't like the funding mechanism. But it had a lot of support. Major newspapers, the Board of Realtors came out and testified, said this is about time. They pretty much acknowledged that they had been part of the problem, and now we're supporting this solution. And the primary sponsors were Representative Taylor of Federal Way, Frank Chop of Seattle, and Senator Lovick of Shoreline. I think this would be a good place to stop, Casey, and see what kinds of questions people have. And then I want to repeat my ask that we need help. I mean, we need information. You can see we know a fair amount about, what was going on behind the scenes, and especially the sundown, the violence and issues that people faced in King County, but we're much less aware of Tacoma and Pierce County history.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Really, really informative. I will be including both of your emails in our follow-up email. So people that are in the room right now, or people that registered that weren't able to participate this afternoon, will get your email. I will put that in the ask as well. So if you don't necessarily know what to comment or ask right now, I will provide their emails so that you can contact them after this is over. But to start off a couple of questions, we do have a couple in the chat that I wanted to start with. And I don't know, Maisha said that she would love to know, or love to see some Chinese population data before and after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and Tacoma's expulsion of families in the 1800s. Do you have any data on that?
Not offhand. I think that's pretty accessible. Tacoma in 1885, at the time of the expulsion, had a larger Chinese community population than Seattle. Tacoma, I think, was at that point still a larger city. And yeah, but the two driving out campaigns were tightly linked. The mayor of Tacoma at that time led the campaign, not only in Tacoma, but then he took the train up to Seattle and helped lead that one too.
Okay. And then I'm including the information that Greg Williamson put in the chat. I'm going to include the link that Charles put in the chat about the covenant home ownership program. And Robert asked, how would one determine if a person or their ancestor or ancestors, I guess, faced housing discrimination prior to 1968? Like, how would you prove that, or how would you determine that exactly?
Well, so as Sophie pointed out, most of the restrictions said white or Caucasian only. That meant that any person of color was excluded. And so that's discrimination across the categories beyond whiteness, which would be the criteria. So I think the law is going to be pretty complicated, and I could try and explain a little more of the legal dimensions of it, which are going to face a lot of court challenges. But the bottom line is that any person of color faced discrimination, and that's the proof. It's in your ethnic background.
Okay.
Yeah, I put a link in the chat to the website, which I should have put up real early, and you can all look. And you'll find then, so one of the questions is about Thurston County. We do have maps. We have virtually the same kind of information about Thurston County that we have for Pierce, demographic maps, covenant maps, and I think also that homeowner disparity, current homeownership disparity charts for Thurston. We haven't finished Mason, or we haven't started Mason. There are a bunch of counties in the West that we are just starting. And I should say that we're not totally finished with Pierce either. We've found quite a number of restrictions, but we can't identify the location because the designations of property have changed over time. So the number 4,500 is going to go up somewhat for Pierce County, and we continue to work on that as along with all the other counties.
Awesome.
Gig Harbor. Oh, Gig Harbor. Whoa. Well, Gig Harbor, I'm pretty sure, was a straight out sundown zone. We did an interview with Dorothy Hollingsworth some years ago. She's now passed away. She was one of the founding members of the Human Rights Commission, I think both the state and elsewhere, a civil rights activist in the 60s. And she talked about moving to Seattle, King County in the 50s and trying to, trying to buy a Coke. I think her story is about, she goes into a grocery store in Gig Harbor and, she's there with her husband for the day and tries to buy a Coca-Cola from a grocery store. And the owner said, well, I could sell it to you, but you couldn't drink it in the store. So I think Gig Harbor has an interesting history that hopefully somebody else will detail.
And I see that Ted has mentioned the Tacoma Library Northwest Room is a incredible resource for local research. And said it's easy to get overwhelmed, but it sounds like I'm going to include that in the follow-up as well. Just any helpful information from around town. Brings up Kitsap too, yeah. You already touched on Kitsap and Gig Harbor just a moment ago.
Yeah, Kitsap, we have similar information online. So if you go to the Racial Restrictive Covenants website, which I sent the link, the menu item for counties will take you to all the maps for the counties that we have worked on so far, the 8 counties of Puget Sound.
Great. Do we have any other looming questions or comments or insights from anybody in the room?
Yeah, we'd love to hear stories or advice, which I suppose could be done live instead of in Latinx population. So this Covenant Homeownership Act is certainly going to include Latinos, Latinx people who would have been considered not white and thus subjected to all of these restrictions. We didn't see, except in Yakima County, the Eastern Washington crew has found one restriction that specifically mentions Mexicans. But otherwise in Western Washington, we haven't seen any specific mention of Latinx people. The populations would have been very tiny prior to 1968. But the exclusions would have affected them. And indigenous people, for Thurston County, we see specifically named, no Indians, but haven't really found that as a specific call out. But again, if you weren't white, you were going to be restricted. And Yeah, actually, the Puyallup Reservation, I should have mentioned this. The Puyallup Reservation, I'm pretty sure, that for years and years, the Puyallup Nation didn't control the land in the reservation. It was all sold off to white folks. But I think there's one or two, you can actually look on that map, one or two subdivisions in the now what is a restored territory of the Puyallup Nation that contain racist restrictions. And I think that's true also of the Tulalip Reservation, which was another one of those reservations that had largely been carved up and sold to white people, some of whom then set up racist restrictions so that the indigenous nation and its people could not ever live in that property. So talk about perverse.
Can you remind everybody who's doing similar work, or your colleagues in Eastern Washington?
Yes, so you can go to our website and find a link and find some information about the Eastern Washington team. Larry Sabella is the director. You'll see the staff. We have a staff page on our website that shows the UW staff and the Eastern Washington staff. They have not yet produced any maps. They've been slower than we are, but I think they're about to show maps for Spokane County and some others. And when those become available, we'll make them also available on our website. They're producing a separate website, but we're all kind of working together also in the one that you're seeing here, which will represent the whole state.
Okay. Any last minute questions? We're getting lots of thank yous, lots of great presentations in the chat now. So I think that people are kind of wrapping up, but we have another moment or so. If you have any other questions, I'm gonna pause for just a moment. All right, not seeing anything in the chat. No one's coming off mute, so we're gonna wrap it up for today. Thank you, Dr. Gregory. Thank you, Sophie, for your insight, your research, your time, and your participation in this event. This is fantastic information. It's really important that we understand the history of what we're trying to work on now. We've got a lot of planning going on. We've got a lot of restructuring going on, and it's important to not recreate issues or learn from history. And we really appreciate you bringing this to our attention.
Well, we appreciate the work you're doing, and I think you'll probably be very involved in the new covenant homeownership program, which we look forward to. And I see a lot of questions showing up now in the chat. Many of them are answerable on our website. They're links to the law and explanations of the law, and they're, I forget what else, and links to the House bill, and an explanation of how to remove a restrictive covenant. So
yep, I'm going to include that link in there. Thank you, Justine. I will include that in the follow-up as well. And if you guys have any questions about this topic, about this these events or anything, you can reach out to me. You can reach out to Sophie and Dr. Gregory. I will provide the emails for everybody in the follow-up email. And I hope you join us for the next one. Our next Lunch and Learn will be on the 25th of April. We'll be joined by the Puget Sound Regional Council. Two of their planners will be talking about equity in housing. So we will hopefully see you then. And thank you, everybody, for your participation.
thank you.